There are times in our lives when we come into areas of uncertainty. We come into situations where we feel like the Lord is leading us in this direction, but we're not sure. Maybe we are somewhat sure, but we have questions. Maybe we are buying a house and there are uncertainties on where we're supposed to buy, if we're supposed to buy. Maybe it's a car. Maybe it's a lifelong partner, futuristic. I see some people here that are going to be looking for lifetime partners soon. Okay, there's a lot of big issues and situations in life that we have that maybe we find ourselves in certain situations of uncertainty, or maybe where we have questions. And sometimes it's in areas where God maybe led us to that point. We feel like God has been guiding us every step of the way, and as good Christians, we do what the Lord instructs us to do, and we ask for guidance, and we read His Word, and He brings us to a place where we feel maybe uncertain, or we have questions. The question that I have tonight is it wrong to ask God questions, or to question God, or to ask God to prove Himself in times and situations of uncertainty? Is that wrong? Is that a lack of faith? I personally have been there, and I would assume with the crowd that I have, there have been times in your life where you've been in a spot or a situation where there's uncertainty, and you're doing what the Lord asks you to do, and you find yourself in a spot of uncertainty. Is it wrong to question God, to ask God questions, to ask God to prove Himself? Let's go to Judges, chapter number 6. Judges, chapter number 6, is where we'll be spending most of our time this evening. Sorry, Brother Mark, I'm making you do the workout. Over this morning, I was running back and forth in the front. I see Brother Mark's moving the camera around, so I appreciate Brother Mark doing the work. Judges, chapter number 6. Verse number 1, I'm going to read a few verses here. I'll give you a chance to get there. Judges 6, verse number 1, And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hands of Midian 7 years. And the hands of Midian prevailed against Israel, and because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made themselves dens, which are in the mountains, and caves, and strongholds. And so it was, when Israel had sown, that the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites, and the children of the east, even they came up against them, and they encamped against them, and they destroyed the increase of the earth, until thou comest unto Gaza, and left no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor ass. And they came up with their cattle and their tents, and they came as grasshoppers for multitude. For both they and their camels were without number, and they entered into the land to destroy it. And Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried unto the Lord. We see Israel is in a tough stretch. It seems like Israel is on a continuous cycle for years and years of they get right with the Lord, they do what the Lord wants, they forget about the Lord delivers them to some ite brother and puts them under persecution, and here's where they're at. They got the Midianites and the Amalekites this time. They come like grasshoppers in numbers. You literally can't number how many people there are. And the Israelites plant their crops. And you know what these sly birds do? They wait till it's about harvest time. Then they come in and they either take the crops for themselves or they just destroy it. So that way they are completely impoverished. Israel is in a tough spot. Israel cries to the Lord for help. The children of Israel cry out to the Lord for help, and let's see who the Lord brings to Israel as an answer. Verse number 11. And there came an angel of the Lord, and sat under the oak, which was in Ophrah, that pertained unto Joash the Abiezrite, and his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress, to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him, and said unto him, The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor. And Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, why then is all this befallen us? And where be all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us, and hath delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. And the Lord looked upon him and said, Go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? So here is the answer that the Lord gives Israel. And I'm sure the answer that the Lord gives Gideon. Gideon obviously is a man who's close with the Lord. The Lord isn't going to come to somebody who's not close to him. So this is a prayer I'm sure that Gideon prayed. Lord, we need somebody to come and save us from the Midianites. We are in dire situations. We are in dire trouble. We need somebody to come save us. The Lord comes to Gideon, and he asks Gideon to do this. And what task does he give him? He says, I need you to save Israel. That's an easy task, right? Save Israel. The verses right before, it said that the Midianites came like grasshoppers in number. Gideon was hiding while he was thrashing a little bit of wheat behind a winepress. That way, the little bit of food that they could have, the Midianites wouldn't come and snatch it up from them. This is where Gideon is at. There are times when we ask God for direction, and he answers, but it leads us into this place of uncertainty. Like I asked you before, have you been in a place where you feel like God led you to a place of uncertainty? Here, Gideon is in that place. He asked the Lord for an answer. The Lord gives him an answer, but it most definitely is a place of uncertainty. We see that Gideon tells the Lord, verse number 15. Let's put our eyes on it. Verse number 15. And the Lord, and he said unto him, O my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least of my father's house. This word least, I looked it up in Hebrew. It means little, small, or young. So here, Gideon says, I'm little. I'm small in my father's house. Whether that means he was the baby or it just means he was small. Gideon was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. Okay? In the Hebrew, that means small. I don't know what that means. Maybe he was short. I don't know. Or maybe he was the youngest. I don't know. He says, I'm small, and my family is poor. War is very expensive. There's armor that you have to have, swords. You have to have food rations. If you are raising up an army, you have to pay people to fight for you. At least you have to feed them. Even in the king's army, the king still has to feed them. War is very expensive. And Gideon tells the angel, he says, one, I don't know how you're going to use me to save them. And even if you are going to use me, I'm poor and I'm short. Or I'm small or I'm young. So we see that God leads up to a place of uncertainty. Israel prays for an answer, and the Lord sends them a broke dwarf. That was supposed to be a joke. I couldn't use the M word. Midget. And this is definitely a place of uncertainty for Gideon as well. But notice Gideon questions and he asks God to prove himself. Verse number 16. Verse number 16. And the Lord said unto him, Surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man. And he said unto him, If now I found grace in thy sight, then show me a sign that thou talkest with me. Here is doing exactly what I asked. Is it wrong to question God? Is it wrong to ask God to prove himself? Well, Gideon does that exact same thing here. He says, how in the world am I going to do it? And if I am going to do it, can you at least show me a sign? Let's see what happens here. Verse number 18. Gideon says, Depart not hence, I pray thee, until I come unto thee, and bring forth my present, and set it before thee. And he said, I will tarry until thou come. So Gideon tells the angel, wait right here, I'm going to get something, I'll be right back. And the angel said, I'll be right here. Verse number 19, And Gideon went in and made ready a kid and unleavened cakes of an ephah of flour. And the flour he put in a basket, and he put the broth in a pot, and brought it out unto him under the oak, and presented it. And the angel of God said unto him, Take the flesh and the unleavened cakes, lay it upon this rock, and pour out the broth. And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put forth the end of the staff that was in his hand, and he touched the flesh and the unleavened cakes, and there rose up fire out of the rock, and consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes. Then the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. So here we see Gideon has questions for the Lord. Gideon asks the Lord to prove himself. The Lord proves himself. He brings an offering, puts it on the rock, does exactly what the angel of the Lord says, touches it, the sacrifice, the offering is consumed instantly, then the angel of the Lord departs. Okay, so Gideon questioned and asked God to prove himself, and he did. What did Gideon do next? Gideon obeyed God. God had a task for him immediately following that. His task was to get rid of the altar of Baal and get rid of the grove, right? We see that in the next couple verses. And you know what Gideon does? Verse number 27. Then Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord had said unto him. Gideon had questions for the Lord in this spot of uncertainty. Gideon was in an uncertain spot, and he wanted the Lord to prove that this is what he wanted him to do. The Lord proved himself, and Gideon obeyed right away, did exactly what the Lord asked. We see a little bit later on, Gideon does the same exact thing again, right? Gideon says, I want you to go up against Midian, and I want you to free Israel. And Gideon has some more questions, maybe a little bit of doubt, and wanted some more direction. Verse number 36. Let's look at verse number 36. And Gideon said unto God, If thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said, behold, I will put a fleece of wool in the floor, and if the dew be on the fleece only, and it be dry upon all the earth besides, then shall I know that thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said. This is the more popular, maybe the more well-known portion of this story of Gideon asking God to prove himself. Here we says Gideon takes a fleece. He says, I want you to soak the fleece and not the ground, and then vice versa, soak the ground and not the fleece. The Lord does so. And again, verse number 1 of chapter number 7, what do we see? Then Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, and all the people that were with him rose up early and pitched beside the well at Harod, so that the hosts of the Midianites were on the north side of them, by the hill of Moriah in the valley. We see in both instances, Gideon is uncertain. He asks questions for the Lord. He asks the Lord to prove himself. The Lord does both times, and immediately he obeys right after. The conclusion that I have to the question that I asked, is it wrong to ask the Lord questions? Is it wrong to even question the Lord or ask the Lord to prove himself in times of uncertainty? The conclusion that I have is no, it's not. But here is what's wrong. When you ask God for answers to specific questions, when you ask the Lord to prove himself in certain situations, the Lord proves himself, but you still doubt and you disobey. That is wrong. Here, Gideon, he asked God, and he even asked God twice. He said, Lord, please don't be angry with me, but I just want to make sure I'm doing exactly what you have me to do. And then Gideon obeys. What would it have looked like if Gideon did what he did, but then he doubted? Or maybe he went back on what the Lord told him to do, or maybe he got caught up in the situation and he stopped trusting God. What would that look like? Well, we have a little bit of an example what that would look like in Matthew chapter 14. Let's go there. Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. Matthew chapter 14, verse number 22. And straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship and to go before him unto the other side, while he sent his disciples away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up in a mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, he was there alone. Verse number 24, But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, and the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them, walking on the sea. And when his disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, It's a spirit, and they cried out for fear. But straightway Jesus spake to them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me to come on the water, come unto thee on the water. And he said, Come. So here we have same exact situation. The Lord asks them to do something. They're in doing exactly what the Lord asked them to do. He said, get in a ship, go to the other side. They're doing what the Lord asked them to do, and they find themselves in a spot of uncertainty. There is winds. The wind is contrary, and it's kicking up huge waves. They're afraid for their life. On top of that, here comes somebody walking out on the water. These disciples are very afraid. They're in a spot of uncertainty. They're doing what the Lord asked them to do. They see Jesus or a spirit or something. They're not sure. And Peter has a question to a command that the Lord gives. The Lord says, fear not, it's I. Don't worry, it's just me. You know what I look like. You know what I sound like. It's me. Be of good cheer. Peter still has a question for Jesus. He says, if it's thou, bid me come, right? So Peter does exactly what Gideon does. Gideon is encountering the angel of the Lord, and he says, if it's really you, I want you to prove it to me. Is that wrong? Our conclusion, we said, was no. So what happens? Peter says, Lord, if it's thou, bid me to come. And Jesus says, okay, come. What does Peter do? Lord, please help me not to break my ankles. He walks on the water. Verse number 29. And he said, come, and when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. Immediately after his questions were answered, he obeyed. He did exactly what Gideon did. And guess what? Just like Gideon saw miraculous, amazing victories, Peter got to walk on the water. Nobody else other than the Lord got to walk on the water. Peter did. But, what would it have looked like if he would have doubted? Even after the Lord proved himself and showed him that this is what I want you to do. What did Peter do? Verse number 30. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid and began to sink, and he cried, saying, Lord, save me. Gideon would have done the same thing. The Lord asked him to save Israel. He proves himself. Gideon, I want you to take the group of guys that you have. I want you to basically get rid of most of them. Anybody that's afraid, I want you to send them home. But Lord, I need all of them. No, you don't. No, I need all of them. I'm going to have all of them stay with me. What would have that looked like? That would have looked exactly like this. Gideon would have sank. The armies of the Lord would never have defeated the Midianites if he would have done it in his own strength, or if he would have doubted the Lord. The Lord tells him, okay, now that the people that are afraid are gone, there's still too many people. How about we go down and watch how they drink, and the people that just go down like dogs and drink, send them away. But the people that are wise, they're looking up, they take a drink, I want you to keep them. Well, Lord, there's only 300 people that did that. Well, you're not going to beat the Midianites with only 300 people. I'm going to keep everybody that we have. The people that were afraid are gone, but I'm going to keep everybody that we have. What if Gideon would have done that? The Lord would not have given him the victory, because the Lord proved himself. Gideon asked questions, and he asked the Lord to prove himself, and he did. At that point, it's just obedience. Peter asked the Lord to prove himself. He said, hey, if it's you, bid me come. Jesus said, come. There was no reason for Peter to doubt at that point. That's the question I have for you tonight. I feel like you're either in one of three spots. I feel like you're either going to be in, or you are in a situation where you need the Lord's direction. The Lord, you feel like you're following what the Lord has for you, and you're in a spot of uncertainty. And you need the Lord to show you exactly what He wants you to do. My challenge to that group of people, if you're in that spot, don't be afraid to ask the Lord questions. Don't be afraid to ask the Lord to prove Himself to you. We came to a conclusion. No, it's not wrong to ask the Lord to prove Himself. And when He does prove Himself to you, don't look back. Don't look at your situation. When Peter was on the edge of the boat asking Christ if it was Him to bid him to come, there was winds and waves. When Peter stepped out in faith, there was still winds and waves. When Peter was sinking, there was still winds and waves. The situation was the same. Your situation is the same when you ask God for answers, when He gives you answers, and when you start following. So don't undo and doubt what you decided in faith. If Peter would have made it all the way to Jesus, if he would have just kept his eyes on Jesus, But he got distracted from his situation, which hadn't changed at all. It was still dire. Gideon's situation was still the same. The Midianites were still there like grasshoppers, but each step of the way, he just kept his eyes on Jesus, obeyed what he had him to do. Maybe that's you. Maybe you have a situation and you're uncertain. Don't be afraid to ask the Lord questions. Don't be afraid to ask the Lord to prove himself, and keep your eyes on him. Scenario number 2, maybe you're in this situation. Maybe you've asked the Lord to prove himself. He has proved himself. You're doing exactly what the Lord has for you. My challenge for you is don't take your eyes off Jesus. Don't look at your situation. Your situation is still the same. Kind of covered that in the last point. Situation is the same. It hasn't changed at all. It's still bad. All those bills are still in. Okay, next month they're still going to come in again. And the next month they're still going to come in. The Lord is going to take care of you. Don't worry about the winds and waves. Keep your eyes on Jesus. The last group of people. Maybe you're doing what the Lord asks you to do. You asked him to prove himself. He's proved himself to you. You were walking on water, so to say. But you did doubt. And maybe now you're sinking. Or maybe now you're just not doing anything at all for the Lord because you felt like you were doing what the Lord wanted to do. It was hard. You took your eyes off Jesus, and now you're just not doing it at all. Peter was in this spot. Peter found himself in this spot a lot. Peter is sinking, and he needs the Lord's help. He cries to Jesus for help, but verse number 31, what does Jesus say? Or what does Jesus do? Immediately, Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him. Jesus didn't forsake him. He didn't let him flop around in the water. Immediately, Jesus stretched forth his hand and helped him. Maybe that's you tonight. Maybe you are struggling. Maybe you've given up. Maybe you asked the Lord for direction, and maybe you feel like giving up. Immediately, Jesus stretched forth his hand and helped him. If you ask for help, Jesus will help you. I apologize. The Lord will not forsake us, and he's with you. Maybe you messed up. Maybe you're in a spot where you've given up. But those three people groups, maybe you have a decision coming up. Maybe you're in a spot of uncertainty and you need some direction. Don't be afraid to ask the Lord for direction. Don't be afraid to ask the Lord to prove himself. If you're doing what the Lord has, don't look at your circumstances. Just keep your eyes on Jesus. And if you need help, ask Jesus for help. He will help you. Immediately help you.